Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, days after the latest coup, Burkina Faso's new military leaders meet with regional bloc Ecowas at the airport in Ouagadougou as protesters against the delegation gather outside of the designated conference centre, many chanting their support of Russia. Also, Ukraine's foreign minister promises to send boats full of seeds to Africa as he continues a tour of the continent in the hopes of drumming up more support in the region for the pushback against Russia's invasion of his homeland. And informal climate talks wrap up in DR Congo. This as Kenya's President William Ruto publishes an open letter calling for a more multilateral approach to helping Africa fight climate change. But first, representatives of the West African bloc Ecowas finally managed to hold a meeting with Burkina Faso's new military leaders days after they ousted the previous regime. The delegates had to hold the talks at the airport as they tried to avoid protesters who'd gathered outside of the designated conference venue. Many at the rallies were waving Russian flags. Last Friday's takeover was the second in the country in less than 8 months, and the envoys wanted to encourage a return to civilian rule. Sophie Lamotte tells us more.
Even though Burkina Faso's new leader, Ibrahim Traoré, told the population to remain calm and not to interfere with the ECOWAS delegation's meeting set for Tuesday, hundreds of people took to the streets of Ouagadougou. Some were simply expressing their support for the new leader, and others were more determined to show their dissatisfaction with the West African bloc. We saw some huge crowds, people on motorcycles, waving Russian flags, people chanting for the French to leave the country and for ECOWAS to refrain from interfering with local politics. The people we spoke to at this protest say they opposed the ECOWAS bloc because they felt it no longer represented them and that it no longer served the interest of the people.
When there were massacres in Sohan, when there were massacres in Seitenga, in Nyurugu, in Djibo, and just recently in Gaskinde, where hundreds of people were executed, what did ECOWAS do? We didn't get any declarations from them.
Despite the tense opposition, the meeting went ahead. The delegation applauded the fact that there was no direct confrontation in that coup and that no blood was shed in the instability of this weekend. Another key issue is the Burkinabe political transition, and Traoré pledged once more to follow the agreements ECOWAS had made with his predecessor, especially for the return of civilian rule in the next 2 years at the latest. Humanitarian aid and public safety in the country were also high on the agenda. Burkinabés expressed high hopes he would restore peace and stability in a context where official figures show that the government control only less than half of the territory.
Sophie Lamotte there for us. Now, as some Burkinabe protesters displayed their apparent enthusiasm for Russian partnerships, Ukraine sent in its foreign minister courting more African goodwill on the continent. Dmytro Kuleba is on a diplomatic tour of Africa, the first such trip in the history of his country. His team have been open about what they want from the 9-day tour, saying that it's to consolidate political support for Ukraine from countries of the global south against the backdrop of Russian aggression. Other priorities include trade and development, and he's already promised to send more grain to Africa. The tour began in Senegal on Monday, from where Sam Bradpriest send us this update.
Ever since the war began back in February, Russia has largely outmaneuvered Ukraine when it comes to diplomacy in Africa. In March, during a UN General Assembly vote, 17 African countries decided to abstain from condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Then in June, during a scheduled video call between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the African Union, only 4 African heads of state decided to listen in. This diplomatic visit, this tour of Africa by Ukraine's foreign minister is about reversing this trend. It's about shoring up support for Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression and annexation of its territories. On Monday, the tour began with a meeting with Senegalese President Macky Sall and the Senegalese Economy Minister. Remember that Senegal was one of the countries to abstain from condemning the Russian invasion. The Ukrainian foreign minister is now moving on to Ivory Coast, where he will talk with officials there before continuing his tour of Africa for another week or so. It remains to be seen whether his efforts will be enough to overturn Russia's diplomatic dominance on the African continent.
Sambrai piece there. Now, in Uganda, the son of President Yoweri Museveni has been fired as commander of the infantry for tweeting a threat to invade Kenya. Lieutenant General Muhoozi Kainerugaba had already been dubbed the tweeting general of Uganda for his provocative posts in the past. On Monday evening, he wrote that it wouldn't take us, my army and me, 2 weeks to capture Nairobi before making a U-turn. As a serving soldier, Kainerugaba is prohibited from discussing political matters in public. Although he's no longer leading the country's ground forces, the 48-year-old has been promoted to rank of general. Museveni's long denied accusations that he's grooming Kainerugaba to replace him as the country's leader. Now, informal climate talks have wrapped up in DR Congo. They were a chance for developing countries to solidify their collective positions ahead of next month's COP27 climate summit in Egypt. The continent faces a dilemma between exploiting its resources whilst the world races to cut carbon emissions. Despite the continent pushing for recognition that fossil fuels are necessary in the short term, it still hopes to move towards clean energy. Kenyan President William Ruto has published this week a letter in the UK's Guardian newspaper calling for a more multilateral approach to helping Africa fight climate change. Vivian Wandera joins us now with more. Vivian, first of all, what did Ruto have to say and why did he say it now?
Well, in his letter in The Guardian, Ruto talked about Kenya having the largest wind farm in the world and said that Kenya also has 92% renewable electricity right now. But Ruto also talked about the urgency on the issue to do with the climate crisis. And his comments come at the backdrop of the just concluded United Nations General Assembly that was held back in September, where many African leaders were shocked when their calls for tackling the climate crisis were overshadowed by the war in Ukraine and the needs of Ukraine, which seemed like Africans' problems were not really an agenda during the meeting, something that he also talked about in his open letter to The Guardian in The Guardian. But he also talked about the climate crisis being one of the things that his government will tackle and one of his government's top agenda. Remember, during his inaugural speech when he was sworn in as president, he also talked about tackling climate crisis as Kenya is now facing some harsh effects from the climate change that is going around the continent of Africa.
Now, this letter was published on the same week as a ban on GMO grain in Kenya was reversed. How is that going down? Is it likely to make much of a difference in terms of helping Kenya or anywhere on the continent tackle the ravages of climate change?
Well, lifting the ban on the GMO crops that has been there for 10 years now, it was imposed back in 2012, has been a huge discussion since the cabinet communique that was sent out yesterday on Monday. And this is because of the concerns that some quarters have about the GMO foods and the effect it has on the human body. But some people say that this is good for the country, as the country has now missed its 5th rainy seasons and about 3.1 million people are facing starvation, especially in northern Kenya, in places like northeastern, in Turkana, where people have died because of lack of food. People have lost their livelihoods, they've lost their cattle, and most of these people are pastoralist communities. So this is a huge loss for them. But also there are concerns on the effect these crops have on the human body. But also there has to be a way for the president to be able to tackle the crisis right now. And it seems that the decision to lift the ban on GMO crops in both cultivating and importing them seems to have been a short-term solution that him and the cabinet discussed, and so that it is a way forward, because this is most of these crops are drought resilient and also resilient to diseases that can kill food easily.
Thank you so much, Vivian Wandera, there for us in Nairobi. Now, a landmark legal case opened in Senegal last month, with fishermen and Greenpeace Africa taking a fish processing factory to court over alleged environmental abuses. There are more and more factories like it across the country. Critics warn that they're responsible for immense level of pollution. Our correspondents report.
The hearing at the Thiès Appeals Court was a historic first for Senegal. Villagers from Kaya, a little north of the capital Dakar, came to demand the closure of a massive fish meal factory.
The factory doesn't respect environmental laws and doesn't respect the promises it made to be allowed to operate legally.
The collective is supported by Greenpeace and is angry about the foul-smelling waste released into the nearby lake. It also laments the over-exploitation of the area's fishing stocks.
5 kilos of fish are required to make 1 kilo of fish meal, which is then used to feed pets and farmed fish in developed countries. But the fish, which is transformed into fish meal to feed animals, is an important source of food for Senegalese populations.
Local fishermen are struggling to make a living, and women who worked in Kaya's traditional fish transformation sector are now all but jobless. Mariama says it's almost impossible to compete with the factory.
The factory scoops up all the fish that arrives at the quay. We are unable to work. There are no fish left.
The factory owners reject accusations of unfair practices. Its CEO says the company employs 60 people directly and a further 300 indirectly, all the while conforming to environmental rules.
A perfume factory smells of perfume. A meat factory smells of meat. A fish factory smells of fish. People who catch fish need to have a fishing license and boats. But there are no fish meal factories in Senegal with fishing boats and licenses to use them. They don't want to develop our industry. They're manipulating us. They bring nothing to the community. What has Greenpeace ever built here?
The next hearing will be held on October 6th.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care. Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches. Bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité. Between 1970 and 1980, a number of Japanese citizens mysteriously disappeared. A mystery that was in fact a kidnapping program orchestrated by North Korea.
もんですから日本海というのはやはり冷戦の海、拉致されたくるりくるりと回って。
In 2002, Kim Jong-il acknowledged 13 kidnappings. But how many people were really abducted, and in how many countries? While the United States supports the victims, North Korea has broken off talks, and many grey areas remain in this international story of espionage. Watch Niigata Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.